Hi, I'm Tom O'Connell with the Eastside Freedom Library. Welcome to the second in a series of conversations we are calling Learning from the Past, Fighting for the Future. The economic crisis of 2020 has left many tenants across the country unable to pay their rent. In a society where most rental housing is in private hands, tenants are demanding a shift in power. New or newly remembered approaches to stop evictions, control rents, create cooperative ownership opportunities are surfacing in Minnesota and across the nation. To expand our own imagination about what is possible, I am joined by three wonderful guests: Professor Amanda Huron, author of Carving Out the Commons, Tenant Organizing and Housing Cooperatives in Washington, D.C., writer Alexis Zanghi, whose really excellent essays on cooperative housing and rent control in the Jacobin magazine inspired this session. Thank you for that. And Jennifer Arnold, who's a co-director of, okay, here's where Inquilinx Unidxs Por Justicia, United Renters for Justice. I know I really butchered that. So welcome to you all. And so I'm going to start really with Amanda Huron. What led you into your interest in and eventually writing a book about limited equity co-ops?
Well, I was doing work. I grew up in Washington in a neighborhood that experienced a lot of gentrification. Sort of after I graduated from high school, I came back and was like, wow, okay, there's some changes happening here. And so I'd been sort of thinking about and concerned about gentrification for a long time in the city. And I ultimately took a job working with a local nonprofit that was doing advocacy around affordable housing in the city. And one of the things that we were doing was supporting limited equity housing co-ops in DC. And so I had not been familiar with this housing form before I started working for this organization. And we were putting on workshops and co-op board members were coming, and I was learning about this form of essentially non-commodified, partially non-commodified housing in the city, and became very interested in it as a source of collectively controlled, at least partially decommodified housing. And so when I then went to grad school after working at that organization, I knew that I was really interested in this form of cooperative housing. And one of the things I was interested in was why it was so valuable to people, even though it wasn't traditional home ownership per se. You know, we can get more into it, but limited equity co-ops don't allow for the same kind of wealth.
Yeah, why don't you just explain just really simply? So, this is not like a technical workshop.
Yeah.
What is a limited equity?
Yeah, yeah. And so, right, so I went on to write my dissertation about them. But what they are is it's a housing cooperative, and a housing cooperative is a housing that's collectively owned by the people who live in it. You can certainly have market rate housing co-ops. They exist all over the country, particularly in New York City, also in DC, other places. A limited equity housing co-op is one in which members buy in for a relatively low amount, and then their monthly co-op fees, or there's different terms, carrying charges, that whatever they pay every month is really relatively affordable relative to the market rents surrounding them. And then if they ever choose to leave, they can sell their share typically for the same amount they bought it for, plus some small increase. So usually in DC, it's typically the rise in the consumer price index over that period of time. And so what this does is it enables people to become homeowners at a very modest cost and control their housing and change it, live in it the way that they want to, make their own rules about the housing, make their own decisions about it. But then, you know, when they go to sell, they're restricted to the amount they can sell it for to keep it affordable to the next household. So that's the idea behind it. And that's why it's called limited equity, because the equity you can build is limited.
So if it was unlimited equity or total equity, a person could own their unit and eventually sell it for whatever the market was, which would raise the price, obviously, and make the next round of people unable to afford the housing that they got. Has that been a stress sometimes? Have people been tempted, folks who have benefited from these co-ops, to all of a sudden get to a point where, hey, you know, how come I can't participate in the private market?
Yeah, and that's actually why I started doing this research, because that tension was arising when I was working for this organization back in 2004, 2005. Was a period, just a couple of years before the housing bubble burst. And so housing prices had really been going up tremendously in central city neighborhoods across the country, but including in Washington. And so there were a number of limited equity co-ops that were being approached by developers who were saying, you probably don't realize this, but your housing is actually really, really valuable, and you can get rich if we work together to take your limited equity co-op and convert it to a market rate condominium structure. The problem with that was that many of the low-income folks who lived in those co-ops could not actually afford to participate in that condo conversion, because it would require existing co-op members to sort of rebuy their unit. It's complicated, but a lot of people got very small buyouts to just leave. And so this happened with a couple of co-ops around that time, and seemed like, ooh, this is potentially really dangerous. This could potentially result in the loss of a lot of affordable housing. A few people benefited financially from that big time, but most people, it seems, did not. But typically a co-op has written into their bylaws that they are a limited equity co-op, that's their mission, so they can't actually just go ahead and make that change. So, but if a majority of members choose to change the bylaws, then, you've got that situation. And so for co-ops, there's, on the one hand, they really value their autonomy and being able to make those decisions collectively as a group and chart their own future. But sometimes that can lead to decisions that may in fact lead to the demise of the co-op. So that's an interesting tension.
Okay. So let's move north to Minneapolis for a minute. Jennifer Arnold, your organization has been looking at limited equity co-ops. Can you tell a little bit about the story about how, first of all, what is the organization? Secondly, how do you pronounce it? And thirdly, how did you get into looking at limited equity co-ops?
Yeah, so my name is Jennifer Arnold. I'm co-founder and co-director of Inquilinx Unidxs Por Justicia, or Tenants United for Justice. We are a renter organization that was founded 5 years ago by tenant members of the community. And really, so since our founding, we worked with renters to make sure that, to improve the quality of housing that people were living in, right? Typical tenant campaigns around repairs, fair rent increases, and typical things that renters struggle with. And we noticed a pattern over time that every time that we fought for repairs or better conditions, it eventually led to the sale of the property by the landlord. And that either happened because we forced repairs and the landlord was like, oh, this isn't as profitable as I anticipated, better that I sell. Or because of work that we did, we discovered that the landlord was committing some kind of fraud and he lost his rental license. So that happened in multiple cases. All of the original landlords that we fought against from the beginning are no longer landlords in the city of Minneapolis. And of course, from the beginning, we also had a conversation with our members that was like, what is your dream? Like, what is it that you really want? And people, of course, said to be able to control my own housing, that my housing, I can stay where I live and that it is dignified and that I get to determine, that someone's not siphoning off my paycheck every month and taking it somewhere else. And so from the beginning, we had this goal of trying to gain territory, right? Land outside of the capitalist market for people to be able to live in perpetuity. And so one of the landlords that we fought against, his name is Steve Friends. It was quite a famous case. Lost his rental licenses and began the process of selling most of his buildings. And there were 5 buildings in South Minneapolis, really close to Hiawatha and Lake Street, that we had a lot of members living, and people in those buildings decided that they wanted to stay and that they wanted to own their buildings. And so we mounted a really strong fight there. So the owner's goal was to vacate the buildings, renovate them, and sell them. And instead, our members who lived there resisted evictions for 2 years. They didn't pay rent for a year because their landlord didn't have a license to collect it. And just in May, mid-May, we were able to win a sale. So the landlord sold the building to the Twin Cities Land Bank, which is going to hold the buildings while we set up the structure of the cooperative. Unlike DC, we don't have a law of tenant opportunity to purchase. And so we weren't able to do the setup at the same time as the fight because it just wasn't clear to us that we were going to win. And so we're using this alternative structure to help us, you know, have 2 years to set up the limited equity cooperative and then buy the buildings into the cooperative. And for us, one of the ways that we're dealing with that issue that you just addressed, Amanda, is we're looking at keeping the land in a land trust so that the purpose of the property is always for long-term affordability and community ownership. So that even if the entire cooperative gets together, they're not able to sell the buildings. And we have definitely learned a lot from folks in DC. We have a lot of partners who come out to support us in learning how to do this. And we've also been working with the city of Minneapolis to try to pass a tenant opportunity to purchase ordinance so that this process is easier for us in the future and we don't have to depend on a landlord selling.
So one of the things that came through in Amanda's Huron's book and also in your testimony right now is the importance of having public policy, whether at the city or state level, that can support and enable the organizing and creation of these limited equity co-ops. So how has that been going? I'll start with you, Amanda. No, I meant Jennifer. I'm sorry.
Okay, good.
Too many people too early.
Great. Yeah. So the city of Minneapolis for the last 2 years has been looking at a tenant opportunity to purchase ordinance. Right now they are in like a research process. They are working with a group in DC and in Minnesota because of the opportunity to purchase law in Washington, D.C. is the strongest in the country. It's the oldest. It has been used most. Of course, we want our law to look like that, but it will be a fight. We hope that the law will be voted, or the ordinance will be voted on this fall. But we haven't yet seen recommendations as to what it will look like. Of course, the struggle is over, you know, which buildings does it apply to? What kind of city or state support is offered, what kind of, you know, like who gets the opportunity to purchase. Of course, we would like it to be a tenant opportunity to purchase, but is that offered to a community developer, to the tenants? And of course, if it's offered to tenants, it takes longer. You know, you have to organize in order to take advantage of that. So there's a bunch of questions that are still being debated.
So Alexa, you came to look at this. You wrote an article about it. How did you get involved? Why did you write an article about limited equity housing co-ops in Washington, D.C.? Oh, I can't hear you. Can you? Got to turn up your volume.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I first wrote an article on rent control for Jacobin in fall of 2017, and I was doing an MFA at the University of Minnesota, and I had previously done journalism. When I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, I'd written for the local Alternative Weekly and then for a local news website. Specifically, the last thing I wrote before leaving New Haven was about people being evicted from a large factory that was used as a live-work factory, but not zoned as a live-work factory or a live-work space. And so people were suddenly, you know, it was sort of an open secret that people had lived in this building for a very long time, but at any point it could be taken away from them. And at a certain point, there was a new mayor, and there was interest in investing in this neighborhood. And suddenly this place was discovered by city authorities. And so I reported on that. And then when I moved to Minnesota, I began reporting on immigration. And I got a grant from the University of Minnesota to research sanctuary movements. And what I found, I had a lot of difficulty because I felt like a lot of sanctuary legislation positioned the state as an interlocutor for people's rights, when it was often the state that was infringing upon people's rights and infringing upon people's sanctuary. And so I wound up following Inquilinx as an organization that was led by the people that were most impacted around renting, and thinking about organizing around basic needs as a way of building solidarity and ensuring rights for everyone beyond these sort of like official legislations, although public policy is obviously very helpful, thinking about grassroots organizations that are based in sort of different practices of solidarity and in fact, solidarity around shared basic needs.
Okay.
So that was how I wound up writing about Inquilinx. And then my editor at Jacobin asked me if I wanted to review Amanda's book, and I said, of course.
Okay, so the editor weighs in, and there it goes. Well, that's great. So I'm going to get back to you a little later when we talk about rent control, because you also wrote an article about rent control, and I also know that there's organizing happening here, as there was in DC years ago. I want to bring in this question about what is the impact of the people themselves who organize into co-ops? What level of participation, what happens? I mean, a lot of co-ops, whether they're food co-ops or whatever, can be very participatory, or they can just essentially be pragmatic and or be pragmatic organizations in which only some participate. In your wonderful interviews, what did you find about that? What was the ways in which people interacted, Amanda, to each other and participated? Was there a lot of variety, or was it, massive participation? What did you find out?
There was a fair amount of variety. I would say in general, in a typical building, you're not going to see massive levels of sort of participation across all of the co-op members. I think typically you'll see a core group that's very active. And it also really depends, though, I think, on the age of the co-op. So some of the ones that were founded, in my book, I looked at 10 different co-ops and former co-ops. I wanted to look at the ones that had made this choice to convert to market as well. But I tried to look at a range in terms of when they had been founded. And so some of the older ones, you do get kind of a turnover at a certain point, and a new crop of people come in. And so that can kind of change the dynamic in terms of participation. But I would say that, there's always a few folks who feel extremely committed to it, maybe because they helped found it or because their mothers or their aunts helped found it. I know one of the questions you had was about the role of women in this. I mean, at least in my interviews and in the cases that there were cases of men taking leadership, but in most cases it was women taking leadership in terms of the organizing necessary to create the co-op, and then the more sort of ongoing, endless organizing required to kind of just maintain it over time. And so yeah, I mean, I think, and one of the things that I was really trying to dig into a bit in the book was this question of participation, really thinking about it as labor, as work, because I think it's important to recognize that this is what we sometimes call participation is really people's time and effort and energy and work. Of course, it's not compensated, it's unpaid work. It's what we might call the work of social reproduction. It's just kind of like the need to kind of reproduce life in a constant way. But yeah, it varied a lot in terms of the levels of participation, levels of amount of time that people were willing to put in. And there's, yeah, so I don't think there's not one kind of consistent answer that I could give to that. But I do think some of the most effective leaders were good at delegating and kind of encouraging other folks to be involved. And those co-ops seem to be the strongest ones, really. Yeah.
So Jennifer Arnold, how do you see participation, from a community organizing point of view? Is that something you really are encouraging?
Of course, yeah. Well, and I kind of smiled when you were talking about it depends on the age of the cooperative, because I think about everybody who lives in our cooperative right now has spent the last 3 years fighting for their housing. So of course, participation is really high.
Yeah.
Right. And it will be. And the buildings are half full. So in the next 3 months, a set of new people are going to come in, and I expect that the dynamic will really change when that happens. And I'm sure there will be conflict over, I've spent all this time building this thing and now you're benefiting from it, right? Because we see that in normal tenant campaigns. And so I'm interested to see how that plays out. And I think it will also be really good. It's good to have, you know, new experiences and points of view involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, like, we tend to run campaigns in specific landlord portfolios, and then our job is to get as many people as possible to participate from that portfolio in the struggle, because that's how we change the patterns and practices of somebody who's abusing the community.
Yeah, okay. One of the things that I was surprised with, or surprised about, Amanda, in your book, was the variety of people and also the level of bondedness that you had. Some cooperatives where there was an ethnic bond, other co-ops, there was a few like social activist types who got together, and others, you know, not so much. And then in writing about the city and thinking about the city, to what extent in your experience, do cooperatives need to draw on people who have really similar life experiences or ethnic identities or some other powerful identity? And to what extent might they work for people in the city, which after all is a place where all sorts of people end up sharing space?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I was really interested in when I started talking to people, was this question of, because when you think about the commons and the way it's at least been theorized kind of historically, has been more around these sort of rural environments and smaller kind of tight-knit communities where people are have a whole lot in common. Yeah. And so I was interested in thinking about, well, how does that work in an urban context where you do have a lot more movement and you have a lot of strangers living together? And I don't know how it, I mean, I'm sure it varies all over the place in Minneapolis, but in DC and I'm sure everywhere, you know, you might have some rental buildings where people do have a lot of ties, you know, and a lot of connections and have been there for a very long time. But we certainly, you know, a lot of the organizers who I've talked to here, you know, also talk about buildings where people just, they go in, they go home, they come out, you know, they don't actually have a lot of relationships. So it's, you know, you don't necessarily have a strong community in that building. You might, but you might not. Certainly through the process of co-op formation, like Jennifer was just describing, I mean, you are working together. It is really through that collective work together that you build that community, I think. And that I think it was really interesting to hear people talk about, was that they were building this sort of community through this work that they were doing to save their housing. It was always this crisis moment when the landlord had decided that they were going to sell, and the tenants thought, oh my God, well, wait, what does that mean? And then, you know, if the landlords are required by law to send a letter saying you have these TOPA rights, these rights to purchase. And so then the tenants getting together and deciding to pursue that. But so that whole process is what bonded people, really, if you want to talk about kind of the bonding. I think, you know, some of the co-ops I looked at were very homogenous in terms of race and class makeup, and others were a lot more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, language, and also in some cases class makeup. I mean, you definitely have some co-ops that have a fairly broad range in terms of incomes, and others that tend more to be just working class people. But I think, you know, I think the relationships between people that were built through working together is really probably the most important thing that I saw. I wouldn't say that a building that was all mostly African-American tenants, for example, was necessarily bonded based on that identity, you know? It was really more through kind of working together and learning who's reliable and who's not, and like, you know, who's going to do what they said they were going to do, and that kind of thing that really helped people build those relationships that were necessary to get it started and to keep it going.
Okay, great. So Jennifer, your organization, is it accurate to say it's primarily or exclusively at this point in your evolution a Latino organization?
It was originally founded by Latino folks and now is definitely mixed race. We have folks who are really, yeah, the racial makeup of the Twin Cities is reflected. Yeah. We primarily work with people of color, and our largest base is still in the Latino community.
Okay, great. So I want to shift a little bit. Part of the kind of purpose of this program is to explore kind of alternatives, a lot of which are brand new, but seem to be having a new rebirth in terms of shifting that power relationship between tenants and landlords, and probably add to that banks and developers and all the other private entities that are involved. And one of the ways that that's been tried over this years and even over the centuries, I found out was rent control. And Alexi, I was reading your article on rent control and found out that it goes all the way back to the Spanish invasion of France. Could you give us a little bit of a 2-minute high points of history of rent control?
Sure. So another one of the earlier instances of rent control that I located, like in the, modern era, was actually during it was an earthquake in Lisbon, which apparently is very important to the Enlightenment. And I think it happened in the 17th century. But there was rent control declared because, I think by some kind of royal decree, because the housing shortage was totally annihilated. Or the housing stock had been totally annihilated, and there was price gouging. So for a long time, rent was regulated as any other sort of good might be. And so you could go to jail for rent gouging in the state of New York. And in the United States, rent control was practiced at the federal level as recently as 1971 by Richard Nixon, along with price controls. And so rent control was usually used as sort of an intervening measure to keep rents affordable while additional stock was produced. And that assumed that it assumed a clearer relationship between supply and demand that we don't necessarily have anymore. We didn't have 7 vacant homes for every person who was unhoused then. And we didn't have the same population of people who are, or percent of the population who were rent burdened or who are unhoused or inadequately housed. And so the history of rent control is, it's long, but it's not as controversial as it has become. I'm not sure why that's happening.
Okay.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah. But I think I'm going to switch for a minute as you adjust your technology.
So, sorry. So rent control we've recently experienced a national resurgence in the discussion around rent control. And I can either go further into the turn that we took around rent control in the 1980s, or I can wait.
Okay. We'll go back. We'll go to Jennifer back here in Minneapolis. So your organization is mounting a campaign, studying a campaign. What's the relationship between your organizing and rent control?
I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is that rent control is so it's like so obvious to renters that it's assumed that it exists. I can't tell you how many people have come to me saying, my landlord is raising my rent $300. Is it legal? But here in Minnesota, we have a preemption, a statewide preemption of rent control. So of course we have thought about rent control since the beginning of our organization because it is the policy that people most want, right? It is the most obvious thing that people want. And there's a lot of barriers in place. The only way to get rent control in Minnesota is to repeal preemption at the statewide level and then pass either a statewide law or local laws, or we would have to do a citywide vote, so a referendum on rent control in our cities. But the city of Minneapolis has our charter is written in such a way that such a referendum couldn't happen without changing the charter. So that would mean we would need 2 rounds of citywide voting.
Right.
So of course we have been looking at this since the beginning. And something I just want to say is that 5 years ago, when I was in rooms with tenant advocates and people who worked with renters and said, rent control is what we need, people laughed. I mean, it was like, yeah, that's way too radical. And now that's not true. People don't have that reaction to rent control anymore, which is really encouraging. So of course, for us, we have been working on a statewide fight to cancel the rent around the pandemic. That is connected across the country to tenant organizing. And we're trying to build a statewide infrastructure that can help us later pursue rent control. We would need a change in our state house and some really serious organizing, because every time those fights happen, they have serious opposition. But of course, it is something that we want.
Okay, great. So the statewide preemption, just to explain to our listeners, that's actually a law that the landlords got the legislature to pass that forbids cities, local municipalities from doing rent control.
Exactly.
That happened back in the 80s somewhere, I guess. Okay. Do you have any sense of the politics of that, or how possible it might be to get that changed?
Well, we would need both of our state houses to be democratically controlled, which they're not right now. So our Senate needs to flip. And then, I think we actually need a really strong organizing plan to win, because every time one of these fights happened, you saw it in California, you saw it in New York, it actually took a couple years of struggle and some elections to oust centrist Democrats to actually get it to happen.
You mentioned cancel the rent, and that, of course, is another move to challenge the traditional power relationships between landlords and tenants. So what's to prevent a landlord from kicking out someone who doesn't pay their rent?
Yeah, so right now there is a statewide moratorium on evictions, which is true in a lot of states across the country. It is in place contingent upon the emergency powers from the peacetime emergency that our governor declared. So every month it is extended a month. So right now it's supposed to end July 22nd, but until now our governor has extended it a month every time. We know that the landlord lobby is trying to erode that. And so either it will start to be weakened, or the governor is looking to take that away in September or so. But it kind of depends on the state of the pandemic. So right now, if people don't pay rent, they cannot be evicted. And our attorney general is pursuing cases around that, which is really great. The problem is that people are accruing back rent, and there's no plan to pay that back rent. Our state hasn't appropriated any extra funding, and there's been no plan around. So cancel the rent really is saying, look, people shouldn't be required to pay that back rent. We are in a pandemic. People lost their jobs through no fault of their own. We're already experiencing a homelessness crisis. We have encampments in all of our public parks right now. And we can't, housing is healthcare. We're in a pandemic. So cancel the rent is really looking at, how do you resolve this problem and not just put it off to the date that the eviction moratorium is rolled back.
Okay. So let me understand. So if I'm a tenant and I haven't been paying my rent, and have been able to do that because of the governor in the pandemic, at some point I have to pay it back? Or is it right now the way the law is? Nothing else happens?
Right. So the way the law is, that rent is just accruing. The rent owed is accruing on the landlord's books. And the minute that the eviction moratorium is lifted, the landlord has the right to take that tenant to court for that rent, eviction court. And, people don't have extra money. So that means you're going to have people with eviction filings on their records, so UDs on their records, who owe landlords rent and who do not have extra money to find a new place to live. So it's a super serious situation. And I would say impacting specifically people who aren't accessing unemployment insurance and other kinds of support. And there's a lot of people falling through those cracks.
Yeah. Okay. So as we move on toward the conclusion, I want to kind of take the conversation in a broader level and talk a little bit. I'll start with you, Amanda. Start a little bit about your vision. I'm going to get to all of you about where your work fits into a broader vision of a more human, equitable, just city. So your book is about limited equity co-ops, but in the context of the commons. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the commons, without again getting too technical, but how you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the commons as really a set of resources that's been partially or entirely decommodified, that is collectively governed by the people who use it. And so it's really kind of simple. And I see it as an ongoing practice. So it's not kind of just like a forest or an apartment building, but it's like this social practice that is ongoing, which again implies the kind of work involved and the kind of relationships and all of that stuff. And I think that, I mean, I think it's important for city governments, for the state to support these kind of endeavors on the part of people who want to create spaces for themselves and their families and their communities. And so I think there can be a relationship between kind of state support for this stuff and people's ability to kind of have collective control over the spaces where they're living and working and schooling and all of this. And one of the things that's been really important in Washington with the limited equity co-ops has been that the city has provided funding to enable tenants associations to help buy their buildings. Because the TOPA law that we have, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, does not guarantee that the tenants are going to get a bargain when they buy the building from their landlords. They're going to have to pay essentially market rate prices. And so it's, there's a lot of issues with our TOPA law, actually. But so the city needs to help fund that. And so the city has been a necessary partner in terms of building these co-ops, getting these co-ops started. But I would also say that, I mean, I think co-ops, when I think about the commons, I think it's important to think a lot more broadly than just, these individual buildings. And I think when we think about housing more broadly, I keep coming back to the concept of social housing, which I think a lot of people are, which is housing that is municipally owned in some way, that does have sort of, that the people who are living in it do have some control over it, but that ultimately there's a very stable entity, the city, that owns the land, and they can kind of maintain it for the long term, really for the long term over time. And I'm inspired, as many people are, I think, by the social housing model in Vienna, which is, and we just had a whole presentation with a Viennese person here in DC via Zoom to kind of talk through social housing ideas for this city and kind of being inspired by them. But I think until we get there, I do think that rent control is like the single biggest thing that can be done that affects the largest number, affects all renters. And we have had rent control in DC. We actually first got rent control in 1919, and I've been doing a little research into that, really brought on by the wartime World War I housing crunch in the city. But we have had it now since, in its current form, since 75. And it's periodically up for reauthorization. And right now it's in that process, and we need to make it much, much stronger. There's many loopholes. So we're working on that now and trying to get it strengthened. But that affects, hundreds of thousands of people. And so that's huge. And then also in this moment, rent cancellation, yeah, as Jennifer was discussing, I mean, that's another big thing that we're pushing right now. There's a ton of tenant organizing going on in the midst of the pandemic. I'm supporting organizing personally just in one building. There's lots of people who are just kind of stepping up and kind of supporting organizing various places. But in this one building, I mean, just to sort of echo Jennifer's point, there's many of the people there are undocumented. People are not receiving unemployment benefits. One of the main tenants who is one of the main leaders who I've been talking to, her family now owes $6,000 in back rent. She and her husband are both unemployed. They both had COVID and are okay now. They have 5 children. They're not going to be able to repay the $6,000 ever. The city is required by law, landlords are required to give tenants payment plans so they can have up to a year to repay. But all the tenants that I've talked to have said, there is no way that in a year I'm going to be able to repay $6,000 on top of now paying my rent again. So it's that the rent cancellation for right now is like critically important. And then I see rent control as being a more like medium-term thing that we have to fight for where we don't have it and strengthen it where we do. But then I think social housing is more the long-term, kind of thinking about housing as a human right, housing as a healthcare issue, as was pointed out, physical and mental health. So I think, when I think about the commons broadly in the city, I think about public spaces, education, workspaces, and housing that can be spaces that address people's real needs, and that are also, that they have some say in, that they have some sort of collective governance over.
Okay. So it's a concluding question, and you did a great job of sort of setting out a vision and a kind of an agenda for the urban commons, grounded in real everyday issues and needs. What makes, and I'll start with you, Alexis, as we're wrapping up, as you think about the city moving forward, both the town called Minneapolis, but the city, what's on your mind? What are you hopeful about, or what's your vision?
So one of the things that's been exciting about the current organizing that Jennifer Arnold has referenced, and that the more historic organizing that Amanda Huron has referenced, I think what's exciting more broadly is the national and international right to the city movement, moving towards collective self-governance in city spaces. So in Minneapolis, that's been really exciting around housing, and now possibly around policing, making the city a site for sort of more just and a more just site for governance. I'm also really excited by Minneapolis's sort of move towards mutual aid. There's a really long history of that here. So, but for instance, the Minneapolis Sanctuary Movement, Parks and Power, Inquilinx, these are all organizations that are working very hard towards collective self-governance of shared resources and the decommodification of housing and of the city. And I think that, we have a lot of people right now who are struggling from COVID, but who never really got a chance to recover from the last big crisis, and maybe didn't enter the last big crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis, with very much. And so, I think a lot of the people who are suffering from the current crisis just never made it out of the last.
Okay, thank you. And we'll conclude with you, Jennifer. What do you see going forward? What makes you hopeful?
I spoke with Ricardo Levins Morales yesterday, and he said, the imperialists are shaking in their boots, right? Like the foundation is shaking, right? People are really worried. I think we're at a time of, I've never seen anything like this, right? We have enormous opportunity, and there's a lot of reason to hope that we can go a long way in dismantling what has been oppressing our communities for so long. That's also really scary. What I'm most excited about is decommodifying housing. Right now, with our Sky Without Limits cooperative, we have an example. We have a model that we can build and grow off of. And I see around me a group of people who are fed up, right? Who are done. And so we have a chance to actually show an alternative world and to sort of like birth it together.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned Ricardo, because our conversation with him was the first in the series of these conversations. And one of the things he said as we were talking was that for so long, organizers and activists oftentimes have kind of accepted what seems to be pragmatic and winnable, and then really ruled out the imagination. I mean, we don't go there, the kind of things that all three of you have been talking about. And now is a moment of both imagination and pragmatic possibilities. So thank you all very much. It's been a great discussion, and thanks everybody for listening. Have a great week.
Thank you.